We saw how that God writes on our hearts His will, His laws, His desires, and as we grow in our walk with Him, the discernment of that grows as well, and can reach and will reach into every aspect of our life. You see, when we come to Him, He owns us, and well, He owns us by right of creation. But then when we are born again, He actually bought us with His blood, which He owns us twice now, or for two reasons. One was that He owns us because of creation. He created us. But then secondly, when we're born again, we say, "Yes, Lord, I want You to come into my life." And the blood that He paid for us is now applied to our lives, and we belong to Him. He purchased us with His own blood, the Scripture tells us. So now number 43, one of the key verses we want to look at is, the first one is found in Hebrews, and then a little later we'll go to John. But in Hebrews 10, thinking of this fact that He has written His laws in our heart, let's consider now what it says of Jesus here. In fact, he's quoting again from the Old Testament prophets. In Hebrews 10, beginning at verse 7, we're going to read down through verse 10. "Then said I, Lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do Thy will, O God." And this is speaking of Jesus. And then he says in verse 8, above when he said, "Sacrifice and offering and burnt offering and offering for sin, Thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law." And so here he's saying, for a time there were those offerings of animals to cover sin, temporarily to cover sin. And that's all it was, is when they sacrificed animals because of sin, which they did on a regular basis. They would bring a lamb, or they would bring a dove, and that creature was slain and the blood ran out of it, and that was to cover the sins of the people temporarily. But it did not really take it away. It just covered it. And so he's saying that indeed this was temporary. I'm putting it in my own words now. And the Lord did not take pleasure in all of that, it says. And I think the reason was because He had something better in mind. And remember, that better thing that He had in mind was to send His own Son into the world. And then he says in verse 9, "Then said He," meaning Christ, "Lo, I come to do Thy will, O God." Do you see that? He repeats it again. Lo, look, behold, take notice. I come to do the will of the Father. That's why Jesus came. And Jesus even said like this in one of the Gospels, "I did not come to do my own will." I didn't come to do my own will, but I came to do the will of the one that sent me, and to finish His work. That's what Jesus said. That was His life. That was how He came. Excuse me. And then He says, "I've come to do Thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that He may establish the second, by the which we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." And so we see that there was one reason that Jesus came into the world. Okay? It's important to get this. This is foundational for what we're going to look at in John then. Jesus didn't come with His own personal agenda separate from the Father. No, He was sent into the world. It's what it says in John 3:16. For God so loved the world, the Father, so loved the world that he sent his only begotten. He gave his only begotten Son. His only begotten Son. His only begotten Son. Just think of that. That whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so the testimony of Jesus was, and it was written of him, that he's come to do the will of the Father, and Jesus testified of that very strongly. I did not come with another agenda other than what the Father has, but I came to do the will of the one that sent me and to finish his work. Jesus knew that he had a specific work on earth. And what was it? It says that he went around doing good. That was part of his work. And why was he ministering for those years? It was, people could see, and we have the record of it today. A minimum record, but it's nevertheless enough of a record of what Jesus did when he was on earth. He was here as the only begotten of the Father, and he showed us what God is like, who he is. He showed us by who he was. He was showing us who the Father is, who God really is, and how he really feels about humanity. That's what he was here for. But not only that, he came here with a very definite mission, a very definite purpose. What was it? It was to be that sacrifice. God did not take pleasure in the death and the blood of all those animals, but he sent Jesus then to be that ultimate sacrifice, because then we are purchased. That was the purchase power. That was the purchase element. That was what it took to buy us back from Satan, because we were lost. Satan had deceived the human race, and now Jesus, by coming and by shedding his blood, he was buying us back. And so it makes it very clear. The main point is that we want to see that Jesus came to do the will of the Father. Now, I want to go, with that in mind, we want to go to John, the 20th chapter. John, the 20th chapter here. And we're going to go to verse 21 then, but the setting of this is Jesus had just given the ultimate sacrifice. He had just allowed the people to crucify him. He had endured all the shame. He had endured all the suffering. He had endured the whip, and he was so marred that he was hardly recognizable according to Scripture. And so he took all of that, being spit in the face and a crown of thorns. He had done all of that. He had done all of that to take our punishment, your punishment, my punishment. He was our replacement. He was the one that took our place. Okay, so now, in the situation we're coming to, in this chapter in John 20, we come to the time when Jesus rose again, all right? So, and it seems like at this point the disciples, they were not sure about things yet, okay? So I believe he had appeared maybe to a couple of them. But here, now we come here now to verse 19 in John 20, and this is what it says. Then the same day at evening, the day of his resurrection, when the first day of the week, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews. So, get the setting here. The disciples were together in this one location, and that the door was shut and it was locked, and they were still being afraid of the Jews, what is going to happen next. And there was so much uncertainty and grief and sorrow still because of Jesus had just been crucified, and he was dead, and he was gone, they thought, and all of this. And so all of a sudden came Jesus and stood in their midst, and he said to them, peace be unto you. Now, can you imagine this? The doors were shut, and they were afraid, and probably discussing these things. Okay, and all of a sudden, there he stood. He just stood. They didn't hear the door open and close. Suddenly, there he stood. There he was. What was the first thing out of his mouth? Peace be unto you. So amazing. So amazing, those words. All right, and then when he had so said, he showed unto them his hands and his side. Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord. He showed them proof of who he was. And then what was the next words he said? Then said Jesus to them again, peace be unto you. Now, notice very carefully the words that followed next. He said to them, peace be unto you, as my Father hath sent me, even so send I you. As the Father sent me, so send I you. That's what he said. And he was saying, and we saw in the scripture, that the only reason that Jesus came into the world was to do the will of the Father. Okay, we saw that very clearly. And now Jesus has resurrected. And this was a short time before he was going to ascend and leave the disciples for that time period. And what was his word to them? As the Father sent me into the world, so send I you. And how did the Father send him? The Father sent Jesus into the world with a very specific mission. And if you remember the words on the cross, Jesus said at one point there at the end, when he was hanging on the cross, he said, it is finished. So Jesus had come, he had fulfilled the will of God, and he had finished that work. And so now, there he is as in his resurrected form, and he's telling his disciples, as the Father sent me, so send I you. The Father sent me with a mission. The Father sent me for a purpose. The Father sent me to fulfill what nobody else could fulfill. That is, bring salvation to the human race. That's what Jesus came for. Now, Jesus is saying, now, in the same way that the Father sent me with a specific purpose, with a specific mission, with a specific calling, in the same way I am sending you. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that awesome? So my friend, the point we want to see here today, very, very clearly, as in the same way that Jesus was sent into the world by the Father with a specific mission, so you and I are sent into this world with a specific mission. Now, how do we fulfill that? It begins with being born again. But that's only the beginning. That's only the beginning. Now there is so much beyond that. And this is what Jesus is telling them. The Father sent me into the world. Now I'm sending you into the world with a very specific mission. And you see, when you remember in the previous message, how that God writes into our hearts his law, his will. And that this is so important to see, that God, when a person is born again, he puts it into his heart. I want to know the will of God. I want to know where he's sending me. I want to know what he wants me to do. That is the mark of a person who is truly born again. That thing rises up in his heart, and he has great desire to see that and to do that and to fulfill that. Now, in a previous chapter, in chapter 15, here, Jesus speaking to his disciples again. He says, ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. Now we may say, well, that was for the disciples back in the day, the apostles. It was. But my friend, I believe it's also for you and me. Let me just read this. Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, and I have ordained you that ye should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever you shall ask the Father in my name, he may give it you. And so we see that God chose us. Jesus chose us to go and bring forth fruit. And this again just confirms, like I said before, these messages all fit together. God has a pre-planned path for us. And he has written into our hearts now the desire and the will, to desire to know his will. And now we see the example of Jesus, how that he came to do the will of the Father. And now we see that as the Father sent him, so he's sending us. And now we see here finally that he chose us. Before we chose him, he chose us. And what did he choose us for? To go and bring forth fruit, and the kind of fruit that will remain. So we see, God has a plan. He has a purpose for our life. How shall we find it? You see, if we're born again, he's put it in our hearts to search for that. He said, ask and it will be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. So may we find it in our heart to seek him for that further path that he has for each one of us.